let's take a minute to take stock of some of the styles we've been talking about this week and in the two previous weeks and kind of add them all together, because in many ways we're talking about parallel tracks through the mid-1960s. We start talking about the British invasion, 1964 through 66 or 67, really from I Want to Hold Your Hand to the release of Sgt. Pepper in the summer of 67. The American response to that, after initially a lot of white pop musicians kind of feeling like they'd been had the pins knocked out from under them, are back by the summer of 1965. Bob Dylan, the Byrds, the folk rock, a lot of the folk rock stuff that we were talking about last week. And now we've talked about Motown, whose success really sort of paralleled that of the British invasion, even having hits before the British invasion, but continuing to go strong through that period, seemingly unaffected by the British invasion. And Stax, who really kind of rise a little bit later after the British invasion, so we get into 65, 66, we were talking about Aretha Franklin, 67, 68, the Southern Soul kind of sound. So what exactly is the influence there? I would say that through Motown, black pop really remained on the pop charts in a way that is almost continuous with what was happening at the 60s. So if you take groups like the Shirelles and the Ronettes and the Crystals and Benny King and the Drifters, and then you transition over to groups like the Supremes and the Temptations and the Four Tops and Martha and the Vandellas, you get a relatively continuous stream of black pop artists at the top of the charts, even if the location seems to move from New York-based to Detroit-based. The rise of Stax, however, in pop really sort of broadened the market for black pop by the second half of the decade. Because the Stax music really brought in a lot more of the more sort of unabashedly black influences, especially those derived from the church, from the gospel tradition. And as I said before, when we say Stax, we're really sort of talking about Southern Soul, because a lot of this music wasn't really recorded in the Stax studios or Memphis at all. One important thing to note is that old school music business practices really remained in force in a lot of this new music, and the roles of producers and songwriters, especially in black pop during this period. And I think it's also important to, as I've said in a couple of different ways, to reinforce that black pop was not really forced off the charts by the British invasion. In many ways, the British invasion was important because it was something new that added a new potent force into popular music, but it didn't really shut down a lot of things that other people were doing. It changed things, but it didn't force black music off the charts. I would say Motown and Stax did not react as much to the British invasion as white pop did. So in many ways, black pop seemed relatively not unaffected, but far less affected than those groups, the white pop groups, who thought they had to come back with something in response to the Beatles, the American response, Paul Revere and the Raiders, the Byrds, some of these folks. What really strikes me are the similarities between Motown and Stax, because as I said before a couple of times in this video, they've always been sort of set up as almost like sort of polar opposites, and the whole question of whether or not Stax music is somehow blacker than Motown music. But look at, if you look at the similarities, both labels had their own studio in which they did all their recording. That is Stax studio specifically, and even if we include the Muscle Shoals Fame studio, that sort of broadens out the Stax side. Still, it's an individual studio, devoted songwriters, studio bands. A lot of it is very similar between the two. So is Stax really blacker than Motown? Remembering that we have to be sensitive when we talk about these issues of these racial kinds of issues. Let's just do a quick sort of comparison here. The Motown musicians and artists were almost all black. There were some white artists involved in, with a guitar player or two, a couple folks who were white who were involved in the Motown operation. But it was black owned, and almost everybody there was black. Now, Stax, on the other hand, was white owned, and the studio band, which is a great thing, was integrated, but still it was, two white guys and two black guys. So in terms of just, if we're just sort of counting heads, in a certain sense, Motown was really the blacker label than Stax from that point of view. Now, sound-wise, stylistic-wise, a lot of people would say it's very different, but it's worth pointing out anyway that these things are never as simple and as facile, especially when it comes to issues of race, as they're often portrayed to be. So it's good to look into some of the other kind of sort of facts surrounding this. It's true, the Stax recordings were much more unbuttoned and loose sounding. When you listen to a lot of those Stax and Southern Soul recordings, you hear especially the singers doing things that never would have shown up in most Motown recordings. There's a kind of improvisational, gospel influence kind of element that Berry Gordy probably would have tamped down a bit because he was afraid of alienating a certain element of the white audience. So in effect, Motown records sounded very produced, very controlled, ironically a lot like the way Atlantic Records production sounded in the 50s when they're juxtaposed against somebody like Chess Records. Of course, now we're talking about Motown being the polished record and the label that's associated with Atlantic, Stax, being the one that sounds more unbuttoned and looser. Motown was obviously more pop-oriented and concerned with mainstream crossover. So when we think about this Stax Motown thing, it's good to turn all these different variables around and think about, develop your own opinion on whether or not you think Stax was somehow a label that was blacker or more authentic and embraced its own blackness more than Motown Records did. Or do you think it's an unfair criticism of Motown to think of them as somehow selling out their blackness for the sake of a white audience? I won't give an answer to that. I'll leave it for you to decide. In the meantime, let's turn our attention to somebody who's never been accused of selling out his blackness in any way, shape, or form, and that's the godfather of soul himself, James Brown.